Okay, so now you should be very familiar with the idea of natural selection. Survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest, survival of, in terms of sexual selection, survival of the most handsome, uh, the individual most capable of attracting females, of sort of convincing the female to select the male for reproductive purposes. So with that in mind, we progressed into, let's get into our next sort of variation, still selection. But we start off with a kind of a humorous picture here. So obviously this is not normal. This is not natural. This is an unfair advantage from the predator, right? So against the predator. So we go now from the idea of natural selection into the concept of artificial selection. So artificial selection is no longer survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest. Is survival of whatever humans think is neat, is interesting, is cool. And this involves sort of the purposeful breeding, the selective breeding, the domestication of plants, of animals, the manipulation of certain genes to create something that wouldn't naturally survive in the wild. So I know you have artists that use paints, or artists that use charcoal or chalk. Well, in terms of genetics, you have artists that create new phenotypes based on the genes, right? They understand genetics so much, they've inbred the organisms for so long that they can generate their own unique phenotype. Again, wouldn't naturally be the best, wouldn't normally survive in the wild, but under domesticated type of situations, these continue to survive. So the examples we're getting into now are like dog breeds. So all of these dogs have been purposefully bred for certain qualities, for their appearance, for hunting, for certain abilities. The wrinkly dog, right? The skinny fast dog. All of these dogs, again, have varied, have diversified, have been changed from the natural gene pool, which was the wolf, right? So that's sort of the idea of artificial selection. Plants, you go to the store, you buy a watermelon, these huge watermelons that, again, huge pumpkins that wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't see that in the wild. These large organisms wouldn't quite make it in the wild. Grapes with no seeds, right? So humans have figured out a way how to generate an organism that is incapable of reproducing itself. So the idea of the seedless grapes. How do they survive? If humans went extinct tomorrow, what would happen to seedless grapes? What would happen to these domesticated breeds of animals that are so dependent on humans for survival? Their life progression would be very, very negatively affected if we were not around. So artificial selection, selecting features for certain colors, certain sizes, certain shapes, certain speeds, all of these aspects of artificial selection. So when we look at artificial selection, we look at for dogs, for example, we start with the ancestral species, which is the wolf, right? So all modern breeds of dogs can be derived from the wolf. So how did we go from that majestic animal to these little guys, little wiener dogs, little chihuahuas, bloodhounds, poodles, chows? Again, phylogenetically, they're linked back. You can see the tree. So our phylogenetic relationship. So there is some shared DNA, but a lot of these organisms have had their recessive alleles really amplified. So that makes them quite distinct from the original stock, which was the genetic base of the wolf. So again, natural selection, the wolf, and we have artificial selection. So the little Chihuahua, the Great Dane, these again linked back to the wolf, right? So how do we get something like this? Well, how do we get a little person, a dwarf, a midget? There was some sort of genetic variation. Well, that happened with the Chihuahuas, and then you got a small dog, right? And then this small dog was bred to this other small dog. And we kept doing this for generation after generation. And and we got even smaller dogs, and now we have teacup chihuahuas, right? So the same can be said for these large Great Danes. Right? We had a mutation that made a larger animal than normal, and it was bred with another large animal, and this purposeful breeding generated these large creatures here. So crazy that these are members of the same type, members of the same species, but very distinct from the ancestral form. Hairless animals, hairless dogs, hairless cats, hairless rats. Again, if Darwin saw these alive today, what would he think? He would kind of sit there and scratch his head like, man. Again, these are not products of natural selection. These are products of artificial selection. These hairless animals would not be able to keep warm in the cold. They would be subjected to sunburn in the heat. Again, they probably would not survive long-term for multiple generations in the wild. So, but they're doing well in the domesticated life inside of these pet owners' homes. So the idea of artificial selection. Oh, the bulldogs, right? Different English bulldog, French bulldog, right? These are products of artificial selection. And these are interesting. I don't know if you know a little bit about the biology of the bulldog, right? Bulldogs started out sort of regular looking. This is a skull from the 1890s of the bulldog. You have a little bit of the maxillary sort of reduction there. The snout starts to be reduced because of mutation. Well, that mutation happened again, right? And it caused sort of that maxillary reduction even further. And that somebody decided, man, that's interesting. I want to continue amplifying this trait. So this mutation was crossed with a normal dog, and then their puppies were then crossed back to the parental species, and we kept magnifying and amplifying, inbreeding to create that really reduced maxilla. And again, it didn't take very long, right? In about 45 years, a few generations, they were able to generate the modern breed of bulldog that we know as the American or the English bulldog, Victorian bulldog. There's different sub variations within those. But interesting, if you know something about bulldogs, they struggle to reproduce naturally. So it's very expensive to breed bulldogs because one, sometimes they can't breed naturally, right? So you got to go to the vet. The vet undergoes the artificial insemination, right? Two, when mom is pregnant, she can't naturally birth the puppies. So you got to go back to the vet, take mom, cesarean, they via C-section, they give birth to the puppies there, right? So two big vet bills, right? In order to make money back, if you're a bulldog breeder, you have to then sell the puppies for very expensive, right? But the moral of this story here, right? Dog breeders have generated a breed of dog, the bulldog, that struggles to reproduce on its own, right? So if humans were removed from the picture, right? Humans went extinct tomorrow. What would happen to bulldogs and many other, house pets, these kind of hairless cats, hairless dogs, bulldogs, right? So they have a hard time reproducing on their own. If humans were not involved in the situation, probably these breeds of dogs, breeds of cats, breeds of animals would quickly diminish and probably go extinct rapidly as well. So artificial selection. I'm going to post a video on these goats, right? So check those out. I think you might find those interesting. And again, still within the idea of artificial selection, right? So we can have the purposeful breeding. And then there's this idea of hybridization, right? So taking two distinctive animals and forcing them to breed via hormonal therapy or through artificial insemination, fertility intervention type of procedures. But I don't know if you're a fan of Napoleon Dynamite, right? Napoleon and the liger. Well, the liger is an actual creature, right? It's a hybrid between a lion and a tiger, right? So the liger. In reality, right, in current biogeographical settings, tigers are forest dwellers, right? India, sort of more Asiatic. Lions, more savanna, plains, dwellers, primarily African. So these things are separated geographically. So in nature, they probably rarely, if ever, come into contact with each other. Right? So they are separated by physical space. Yeah. But maybe in a zoo, right? Maybe in a zoo they're raised together. They're right across the cage from each other, something like that. So there have been many situations where hybrids, genetic hybrids, have been sort of generated. There's all kinds of weird mixtures of leopards with lions and jaguars with tigers and just all kinds of weird creatures that, again, wouldn't normally occur in the wild, but because of artificial selection, sort of artificial hybridization, we get some of these weird, interesting mixes. We can take it a step further, and instead of actually taking the two gametes, the sperm and the egg, we can implant certain genes. Right? We can extract certain genes. And this is then the idea of genetic recombination. So it's sort of like hybridization, but at the gene level, not the whole gamete, the sperm or the egg level. This is individual genes that are inserted or removed from the genome of an organism. So for example, we have, let's say, fish, right? So if I take the growth hormone of a human growth hormone, extract that DNA sequence and implant it into the genome of a fish. So this fish would then be 99% human, or I should say 99% fish, 1% human, as it gets that human growth hormone instruction. So it starts to produce actual human growth hormone. It's a fish producing human hormones, right? So that's what we call these genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and they're generated by this idea of genetic recombination. I don't know if you know these little bugs, these little lightning bugs, fireflies. They fly around at night and they glow. Somebody thought, man, those are really cool. And somebody thought, fish are boring. Well, what if I can take that little gene that causes the bioluminescence, the flashing light, and infuse it into fish? And that has been done, right? So now we have fish that are swimming around with firefly genes, right? So they are able to sort of bioluminesce with this gene. So quite interesting. Spider goat. I don't know if you're familiar with spider goat. So here we have 99% goat, 1% spider. The web producing instruction of spiders was infused then into the goat genome. So when the goat lactates, when they produce milk, they're actually producing the same protein that is in spider silk. Right? So we drain away the lactose, and they keep then this spider web. And because it takes so long to make silk from little worms and spiders, that's why silk sheets, silk clothing is expensive. Well, this is going to make it economically faster, easier to produce more silk to get the profit sooner for these business people there, right? So within these GMO organisms, the genetically modified organisms, science has the capacity to do this, right? Now we get into another, I don't know if I want to say complication, but another issue, another perspective, the idea of ethics, of morals, right? Just because we can do stuff, should we be doing this, right? Should we be manipulating the organisms? Again, it's done for humans' benefit, but what impact is it having on the wild organisms, right? So there's been many cases where modified organisms have escaped. So these fish have escaped in these artificial ponds, and they go back in the lakes and the streams, and they're big fish. So they dominate. They eat up a lot more prey than they normally would. So they're starting to affect populations in their natural environments. Because they're well adapted, they then pass this modified gene into the gene pool. So that's one of these. This and the hybridization would be one of these big branches in the evolutionary track. So we just had tiger, we just had lion, we just had fish, and now all of a sudden we have this new combination: this fish with human DNA, this fish with firefly DNA, this goat with spider DNA, right? And these are these punctuated equilibrium type of events that trigger a new trajectory in the evolutionary process. So I hope that made sense, right? So that's the idea of selection, right? So selecting particular aspects. So the way you would select a potential mate, the way you go to the grocery store and you select a watermelon, right? It's always neat to see people. They pick up the watermelon, they knock on it, they smell it, they shake it, they weigh it. So just like you would purposefully select certain things, wild animals also do the same, either in a natural setting or in an artificial type of framework. So that's the idea then of selection. Right? So we're halfway through the evolutionary concepts. So I will get this one uploaded and hopefully soon. I don't know if I can get through them today. I'll try to get gene flow and genetic drift, but for sure you'll have them at least by tomorrow, so you can start getting ready for your next, or for your, I should say, for your first exam. And I'll send out an email that addresses that. Alrighty, so I'll call it a lecture for now, and I'll get this thing converted here. All right, so see you next time.